the possibility of a military confrontation between two nuclear-armed powers is larger now than it's probably been since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
Hello and welcome to the GZERO World podcast. This is where you'll find extended versions of my interviews on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and this week, Russia, the West, and the countries caught in between. There's a bunch of them. We've spent a lot of time on this show talking about Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But today, we are zooming out to look at the big picture of Russia's role on the global stage. NATO just added 830 miles of really cold territory on the Russian border, and countries like Brazil, India, and South Africa are trying to walk a geopolitical tightrope through the middle of it all. Is this the beginning of a new Cold War? Surely, actually, it's worse between Russia and NATO, and how much room is there in the messy middle? We'll talk about all that and more with my guest, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more. GZERO World would also like to share a message from our friends at Foreign Policy. An endangered porpoise, a fish whose bladder fetches tens of thousands of dollars on the black market. The highly desirable and delicious colossal shrimp. Travel to the Gulf of California on a new season of The Catch, a podcast from Foreign Policy and the Walton Family Foundation. You'll hear about the tension local fishermen face in providing for their families and protecting marine habitats, and your role in returning balance to the environment. Follow and listen to The Catch wherever you get your podcasts.
Ambassador Ivo Daalder joins us. Good to see you.
Hey, great to be here, Ian.
So much to talk about. NATO, to start, since you've got a little bit of experience there. How significant, not just symbolically, but in real operational terms, is it that Finland is now a member over 800 new miles of border of NATO directly with Russia?
It's extraordinarily significant. It's probably the most significant new member of NATO, at least since Poland joined, but possibly even since the end of the Cold War, when you really think about it. Here's, if you're a Russian military planner, you all of a sudden have to think about a border that you didn't really worry about, 830 miles long, twice as long as any other part of the border that Russia has with current NATO members. It now needs to defend that border. It needs to think about how do we make sure that NATO doesn't come anywhere near some of the most important strategic assets that Russia has. In the Kola Peninsula, way up north, it is a submarine base. It has nuclear weapons capabilities there. And they're now within striking distance of NATO ground forces in Finland. So that's one big thing. Second big thing is that Finland is an incredibly capable military. These are people who have been armed in their neutrality. They've never skimmed on the ability to defend their territory. And they've been part of NATO military operations in Afghanistan and Kosovo, in Libya, around the world in many ways for the past 30 years. They're pretty integrated. Their capabilities are real. They have a ground force that is not only very capable today, but they can massively bring in reserves over time. So you're adding real military capability to the alliance. And then finally, one of the most exposed elements of NATO are the Baltic countries, who are close to Russia, small, not very large when it comes to their own military capability. Well, right across the Baltic Sea now has Finland. And so the Baltic Sea is becoming a NATO lake, with St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad the only Russian entry points, but the rest of it is now all NATO, particularly once Sweden, of course, joins as well. So it's really significant.
I understand, of course, everything you just said, and yet when NATO speaks about their integration of other countries, they talk about it as a defensive alliance. Now, I mean, if it's a defensive alliance, then why would Russia be so concerned about all these things you just mentioned?
So it is a defensive alliance, but Russia is looking at its military capability in its own defensive terms and in its own offensive terms. If it goes to war against any part of NATO, NATO goes to war against Russia. Would NATO, when it is at war with Russia, say, oh, our military capability is going to stop at the Russian border? Or is it going to be penetrating parts of Russian territory in order to undermine Russia's capacity to continue its aggression? So the offense-defense is a question of who starts the war. But once the war is started, things change. Then you have to think about how deep can you strike into Russian territory in order, the goal being, to restore the borders as they are. And now having Finland part of a potential war theater is real. Doesn't make it an offensive alliance. It just says, if you attack, now you have to worry about that part of your geography, when before you didn't.
Now, when I think about the relationship between NATO and Russia today, we can't quite just call it a Cold War. I mean, the economics, of course, have been cut off. The gas is no longer flowing. The oligarchs have been sanctioned. The sovereign assets of the Russian central bank have been frozen. Larry Summers was just on this show saying that they should be seized and given to Ukraine. What do we call that? I mean, what is the state of relations between NATO and Russia today?
It's adversarial to the point that Russia now sees NATO as its enemy, and frankly, NATO sees Russia as an enemy. Not just a threat, but an enemy. A country that is determined to find a way to exert influence through use of military force, possibly including against NATO territory. That's something that we haven't thought about in the NATO parlance since the end of the Cold War. And frankly, even during the Cold War, the likelihood of a Russian military attack, certainly towards the end of the Cold War, was discounted. But here we see it in real life, every day. Russian military forces crossing a border in order to enlarge their own territory. Imperialism and aggression in real time. So the relationship is not one of partnership. When I was NATO ambassador in 2010, we talked about the potential of a strategic partnership with Russia. No one in NATO today talks about the potential of a strategic partnership with Russia. It is the most important military threat, and that's very different.
So the Soviet Union collapses, and what had been 15 republics is now basically one sort of plus Belarus. But in terms of the actual relationship between the West, NATO, and Russia, or Russia plus, I mean, really, you can take away those interim 30 years. What we're saying is that the military confrontation today of the global order, leaving aside any other threats, is absolutely not just as bad as when the Cold War was in place, but in some ways it's worse.
In some ways it's more dangerous.
Yeah.
Because during the Cold War, since the mid to late 1960s, there was an attempt by both the United States and the Soviet Union to find ways to coexist, to talk to each other. There was arms control, there was the hotline, there were a whole series of agreements that said, let's manage our military competition in a way that we know that the only reason we will ever have a war is if somebody decides that that's what they want to do. No accidents, no escalation, none of that. We even had arms control agreements. We had a European Conference on Security and Cooperation that led in 1975 to the Helsinki Final Act that defined the relationships of all countries in Europe and North America. All of that's gone. Russia has just walked away from the last arms control agreement that existed, the START agreement that limits the nuclear warheads that the United States and Russia are allowed to deploy. Russia has just said that they will no longer tell the United States when it tests ballistic missiles. We've been doing that for 50 years, we're telling each other, because we want to know if they're testing a ballistic missile that is not an attack. That's all gone. So it's a very, very dangerous military situation in which deep distrust of each other, the Russians of NATO, particularly the United States and NATO of Russia, is leading to the possibility of a confrontation. The possibility of a war beyond Ukraine, the possibility of a military confrontation between two nuclear-armed adversaries is larger now than it's probably been since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
Russia just announced that they're going to put tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. That hadn't existed since the days of the Cold War. I mean, on the one hand, there's so many times that we've seen Putin talk about his nuclear arsenal that it almost is getting normalized. And yet, in the context of all of these fail-safes that are being taken away, this does feel like an intentionally endangering move.
Yeah, clearly Putin is becoming used to rattling his nuclear saber in ways that, frankly, we haven't seen for a very long time. Maybe since Khrushchev was banging his shoe at the UN and, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The way that Putin talks and the people around Putin talk about nuclear weapons, Medvedev, his deputy national security chief, talks about nuclear weapons as if they're the same as conventional weapons, but just a bigger bang for the buck. It's really worrisome. The actual movement of nuclear weapons potentially to Belarus, as long as they remain under firm Russian control, I actually have less concern about. I don't think that is leading to the first step to nuclear war. I worry about whether the Belarusians are going to be trained to use those weapons, but even so, we have NATO countries that train to use nuclear weapons, even though they don't have them. So I'm not particularly concerned about the technical and tactical details. I'm worried about the strategic impact. What are you trying to do here, Mr. Putin? Are you trying to send a warning that we, the Russians, are willing to defend our gains in Ukraine by threatening and possibly using nuclear weapons? That I'm worried about. I think it's real. I think he's trying to do it to deter the West, and he's been very successful in doing so far. The West has provided arms, intelligence, training, but not troops.
But not troops, no.
But
everything else. And of course,
Everything
from the
else.
Russian perspective, they see themselves as at war with NATO, which is part of why I'm framing this so much in terms of the broader Russia relationship with the West, because that's truly a step.
Yeah, and to be frank, although NATO is not at war with Russia, and in fact, NATO, all the kinds of things that are happening in support of Ukraine is being done bilaterally by individual NATO countries and others, it clearly is that the situation today between NATO and Russia is completely different, certainly than I was there 10, 12 years ago, but even different than it was before February of 2022, when at least you thought you could talk to them in some way. Remember, Putin and Biden had a summit meeting in Geneva in the middle of 2021. There was this idea that you could establish guardrails around the relationship. All of that's gone. And it's gone on the NATO side, and frankly, it's gone.
Yeah, Biden's relationship with Putin was never as connected, as mutually respectful as it has been and remains personally with Xi Jinping, but nonetheless, at least they were treated as a normalized country. Like it wouldn't have been bizarre for the Russians to show up at the G20, for example, the way that even Mohammed bin Salman, after the Khashoggi assassination, was seen as a bit of and called by Biden at the time, a pariah, though of course he's been completely re-accepted. Now, on that front, the fact that the International Criminal Court, okay, not recognized by the United States as legitimate, but by most other countries they are, directly referring to Putin, finding Putin a war criminal. There's no way to come back from that in terms of Western institutions, is there?
No, I think it's pretty difficult. Remember, it's happened before. Milosevic was a war criminal. It changed the relationship between the West and Serbia in a pretty fundamental way.
Gaddafi, I think, was as well.
Gaddafi was a war criminal.
Bashir.
Charles Taylor in a different way. But in thinking through who did the West have a direct confrontation with and what happened when they became war criminals, there was no way back. Milosevic had to go to The Hague. Frankly, of course, Gaddafi didn't survive. The relationship between the United States and the West and Russia is going to be forever painted by this reality that Vladimir Putin is now wanted as a person who committed heinous crimes, credible crimes, taking children away from their parents and putting them in other foster families or whatever you can talk about. It's extraordinary. That doesn't happen normally. He now is accused of that crime, and the ability for the West to have normal relationship with him at the G20 or anywhere else is going to be virtually impossible. It's going to be very interesting to watch if he comes, which is a big if, and if he does come, what the West will do.
On the big other side of that question is, a war criminal is someone that you intend to defeat, someone you intend to remove, obviously not someone you can work with. Well, every other person that has been painted as a war criminal, you could defeat. There's really no way for the West to defeat Putin.
Well, there's ways but at a price you're not willing to pay. So the question then is, what's the relationship between the West and Russia going forward?
Right.
Is there a possibility of sitting down at the table with Vladimir Putin to negotiate an end to this war, even if the Ukrainians want to? How do you do that? Are the Ukrainians willing to sit down with Vladimir Putin at some point? They may be willing to sit down with Russians, but are they willing to sit down with Vladimir Putin? Are other countries going to host Vladimir Putin? Some will no doubt. The Chinese will no doubt host Vladimir Putin.
Course.
After all, Xi Jinping came 2 days after.
That was a state visit.
As a state visit. The South Africans are indicating that they will welcome Putin in the BRIC summit. Modi hasn't, as far as I know, said anything about the G20. Very unlikely that they're going to say no.
Right.
So there are countries that are going to sort of say, yeah, we understand, but the realpolitik, the way we need of the world means we can't ignore the leader of Russia, indicted war criminal or not. But we in the West, I don't see von der Leyen or Scholz or Macron or Trudeau or Biden or Sunak sitting down with Vladimir Putin now after all of what has happened. And the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has put its stamp on this. He is a war criminal.
Now, there is, of course, an enormous difference, and you started to get at this, between the way the collective West feels about Putin and everyone else feels about the West, everyone else feels about Russia, feels about the war. Because, you weren't just talking about China and Iran and countries that are considered also in various ways adversarial to the West. India is a strong member of the Quad, partner in many ways of the West, but their relationship with Russia is virtually identical to China's relationship with Russia. South Africa's perspective is very aligned. Brazil, Mexico. So, as soon as you get out of the collective West, as you just described it, suddenly it's not talk about war crimes. It's not talk about Ukraine has to be redressed no matter what. It's these sanctions are hurting us. We need to keep doing business with the largest country geographically in the world with all their resources, and you guys are hurting us. What do we do about that?
It's a real problem, and I think people in the White House and in the chancelleries and the Élysées and other places are spending a lot of time thinking about how do we change not only the narrative, because the narrative is important, and clearly the Russians were very good at saying everything that you're suffering as a consequence of this war, higher fuel prices, less food, and therefore higher food prices, and everything else that came from it, is because of the sanctions that the West has inflicted, as opposed to, well, wait a minute, why did these sanctions get imposed in the first place? Because you invaded another country. And I think the West sort of believing that because they had a pretty darn good vote in the UN General Assembly, 140 plus countries.
In condemning the invasion.
But
not in supporting the sanctions.
No, but in condemning the invasion, they thought, well, everybody, of course, understands this is a terrible thing, and we have to do something. We're not going to war directly, so therefore we are imposing sanctions. And by the way, we will allow, of course, food and other agricultural products to be exported. We didn't think that people would see the sanctions as the problem as opposed to the invasion. And in fact, that is the reality. The reality is when you're the man or a woman on the street in Brasilia or in Johannesburg or frankly in Delhi and your fuel and food prices have gone up, you're going to say, wait a minute, where's the problem here? It must be the West, it's not Russia. And so trying to figure out a way to start talking about this in a different way is one part of it. But the second part of it is it puts pressure on finding a solution to this conflict. And it's not a surprise that at the G20 meeting in Indonesia, the intervention by the Ukrainian president was to lay out a 10-point peace plan. And there is a question, at what point does military confrontation start to compete more effectively with diplomatic engagement and in terms of how to talk about this war? We're not quite there yet. There's a pending Ukrainian
But it
offensive.
feels closer, doesn't it?
It does feel closer.
Yeah.
I think people know that the war is starting to hurt the image, but more importantly, that there isn't a lot of juice left in the war, in the sense that there is enough materiel and enough manpower to continue with the high intensity that we currently have. Lower intensity, probably for months, if not years, possibly even decades. After all, this war at a low intensity point has started in 2014.
Right.
It's been going on for almost 9 years. But at that point, you start thinking about, well, is there a way that we can start talking about it? Today, no, can't say that.
Now, before we close, I do want to ask you a little bit about NATO, since it's an area you know an awful lot about. Stoltenberg, Secretary General, is nearing the end of his term. And so there's been a lot of talk about who might that replacement be. You and I know many of the names, von der Leyen from the European Commission, Chrystia Freeland, the Canadian Deputy PM, a number of others that have been discussed. Without talking about who you think's going to get it, I'm wondering how much you think it matters. Does it? I mean, does the person running NATO really make a difference at a time like this? And if so, how?
So at a time like this, yes, because that person does represent the collective voice of the now 31 countries. 31 countries speak in some ways all the time, but if you want to know what does NATO think, you talk to the Secretary General. Although the Secretary General has no power, no vote, no ability to move our machinery, that depends on the member states. He does have soft power, as we would put it. He has the ability to persuade, to make the argument. And Stoltenberg has been very good at this. And so having someone who can be the interlocutor with the outside world, or even with allies. So he was very important to help the Turks understand why they needed to move on Finnish and hopefully Swedish soon membership of NATO. So that's one part of the role. The other, and Stoltenberg was very good at this, is when you have a recalcitrant member, just mentioned Turkey, but for 4 years, the United States, led by Donald Trump, finding someone who can stand up to, but also collaborate with that recalcitrant member to make sure that the alliance as a whole survives, is really important. And as you think about who is going to be the next Secretary General, some people will no doubt start thinking about, well, what happens if there's a change in leadership in an important country, not least in the United States? Can we have a NATO Secretary General who can make the case for NATO to a NATO skeptic and do so in a way that at least keeps the alliance together, which, to Stoltenberg's credit, he was able to do.
So what I'm hearing is that strong leadership.
Strong leadership is important.
Very important.
And it's more important sort of now than it was perhaps in the past.
Okay, if you had to bet on someone, it would be who?
Oh, I think von der Leyen would be a terrific leader if she were available. And
You
the
think
question
she's likely to have it? Because, of course, a lot of people are very happy in her present position.
well, that's the dilemma.
Especially the Germans,
The dilemma is, will she be reappointed as EC commissioner?
Right.
Because she's president, because she's been terrific in the job. She's probably the best person in this job in a very, very long time. But for that reason, she'd be very good as NATO Secretary General. So it's this balance and
And she was defense minister in Germany.
She was
of course.
defense minister in Germany, and she was, contrary to many in her own party, and indeed in their own government, pushing for more defense spending.
Not that Germany had any defense capabilities back when she was doing it.
No, but she was at least
yeah.
pushing for it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. That's
but
true.
she did have a chancellor, a leader of her own party, who wasn't particularly interested in that.
Yeah.
So she understood that basic reality and the importance of being a good ally.
So that's who you want. Who do you think's most likely to get it?
So I think the fact is that we don't know yet means that might well be where we have been for a long time. Why don't we just keep Stoltenberg for another year?
Another year, yeah.
75th anniversary in Washington next year. Let's see how the European leadership thing shakes out. They have to start really soon, get to a conclusion. Vilnius, NATO summit in July. That's the time.
Okay, final question for you. It is at least possible, maybe even reasonably likely, that Erdogan loses in May, his election. He has been, without question, the most recalcitrant, the most problematic NATO ally. I've had Richard Haas on this show saying they should be taken out of NATO. They shouldn't be an ally. How much will it matter? What will the impact be if Turkey is post-Erdogan?
It'll matter a lot because
For NATO?
not only, yeah, but it'll certainly matter for Turkey.
Yeah. No, I know that. Yeah,
but it'll matter for NATO in part because the opposition is today campaigning very much on the platform to lean more to the West. And so it has an interest once it does come to power, once you have a new parliament and a new president, to demonstrate to its allies, the United States, but also its allies in Europe, that it is and will be a good ally. First thing it will do, presumably, is allow Sweden to come in to NATO. But more importantly, it will start talking in a way that Turks used to talk. Yes, still an interest in the Middle East, still as a country that can be a translator of Arab and Muslim sentiment to the West, and vice versa, of Western sentiment into the Middle East. It'll always be there. It's a strategic country in that region, but we won't doubt anymore where its bona fides lie, and it won't start using the power it has of saying no, which is the real power that countries have in NATO, of mucking up the works, which is what Erdogan has done so effectively.
Ivo Daalder, thanks for joining.
Always a pleasure, Ian.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World podcast. Do you like what you heard? Of course you did. Well, why don't you check us out at gzeromedia.com and take a moment to sign up for our newsletter. It's called GZERO Daily.
The GZERO World podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, places clients' needs first by providing responsive, relevant, and customized solutions. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more. GZERO World would also like to share a message from our friends at Foreign Policy. An endangered porpoise, a fish whose bladder fetches tens of thousands of dollars on the black market. The highly desirable and delicious colossal shrimp. Travel to the Gulf of California on a new season of The Catch, a podcast from Foreign Policy and the Walton Family Foundation. You'll hear about the tension local fishermen face in providing for their families and protecting marine habitats, and your role in returning balance to the environment. Follow and listen to The Catch wherever you get your podcasts. You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.